Now, the Three Martini Lunch with Greg Corombos and Jim Geraghty.
And welcome, everyone, to the Friday edition of the Three Martini Lunch, along with Jim Geraghty of National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. We have good, bad, and crazy martinis to close out a wild week here in Washington. And Jim, it's not often we start with somebody who's clearly a liberal. In fact, I've never even heard of this person, but I read the opinion piece in USA Today anyway, and it made a lot of sense, largely because it's parroting what we've been saying for a long time as conservatives, and that's that the executive has way too much power. It's just interesting that the liberals always figure this out when a Republican holds the office. But the author is a guy named Rob Montz. He operates a place called We the Internet, and his opinion piece says this. Another day, another avalanche of news about the president, berating Democratic leaders on camera, unceremoniously announcing the departure of his chief of staff, calling his former Secretary of State dumb as a rock. It never lets up. Trump is a ubiquitous, suffocating presence in American life. It wasn't supposed to be like this. The modern presidency is the framers' worst nightmare, a flatly unconstitutional concentration of power. As the Trump era has made abundantly clear, the office itself, its size, scope, and prominence in American life is the driving force of dysfunction in our politics. Article 2 of the Constitution outlines a modest office. The president was to execute the laws passed by Congress, appoint some key government posts, interface with foreign leaders, and use the veto to check populist passions. That's it. The president was basically a lackey to Congress. That's probably debatable on some extent. The deliberative and more democratically sensitive branch of government. That design worked pretty well for the first 150 years. On the rare occasions when the executive branch assumed excessive powers, such as Lincoln suspending habeas corpus protections at the height of the Civil War, the office's constitutional constraints kept the commander-in-chief in check. He says that all changed with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, making it a more populist office with his fireside chats, and then just over the next 80 years now, just ramping up more power. And then when a new party takes over, they don't check that power, they keep it, and then they add to it and they hand it off to the next guy, and it just builds and builds and builds. So, Jim, I'm sure the Democrats will conveniently forget all this whenever they win back the White House, but at least they're understanding an important constitutional principle now. Hopefully some folks can get behind this when we actually have an opportunity to do something about it.
If we can pass this while Trump is president, make it hard for them to undo it when we have a Democratic president, maybe we could actually get somewhere. I've been thinking about this in terms of how the Trump presidency will change once Democrats take over on January 3rd. And for the first 2 years of this presidency, one of the big stories has been the bit-by-bit rollback of things that the Obama administration wanted to do, from the Trans-Pacific Trade Pact to the Paris Accords to the Clean Air Plans. A couple of regulations were rescinded by not just Trump, but also by the Congressional Review Act. But there were a whole bunch of things that were undone by executive order. And it was this very hard lesson to Obama that all kinds of things that he had done, I have a pen and I have a phone, that he did through executive order can be undone by the next president through executive order. If you want to make a change in the law and make a serious lasting change in the policies of the government, you have to do it through legislation. The Iran deal, right? Now here's the thing. We don't know what's going to happen in 2020, but you'd have to acknowledge there's at least a decent chance Democrats will win. And if that happens, chances are the next Democratic president will undo everything Trump did through executive order. They won't be able to undo the tax cuts unless they win a pretty solid majority in the House and Senate. They won't be able to undo anything that was done through legislation, drilling in Anwar, repeal of the mandate for Obamacare. Everything that's done through legislation is a lot tougher to undo, but anything you do through executive branch can be just undone by a successor who disagrees with you. And I don't know about you, Greg, this strikes me as not a terribly wise way to govern, because every 4 to 8 years you get a new president in there who's like, oh, I don't like that. Wait a minute, let's undo that. And you end up with, kind of like a light switch going on and off. And it drives me crazy when my kids do it. I don't like when presidents do it either. I'd kind of like our policies to remain the same and not get flipped back depending on who gets 270 electoral votes over and over again. So if we can get the left on board with this, then we actually could have a readjustment of the balance of powers and a bit more of an effective check and balance. And maybe you'd have to have some sort of big comprehensive change. It's kind of interesting. You look back at not just the Trump administration, the Obama administration. You could probably argue to a certain extent the George W. Bush administration and the Bill Clinton administration. They all had at one point or began with their parties controlling Congress, and they pushed as far as they could, Hillary Care under the Bill Clinton and all that stuff. And then things go wrong. And all of a sudden people are like, oh, we don't like this. The other side wins at least one seat. And in the case of, sometimes you get welfare reform with Bill Clinton, but a lot of times you get something of a stalemate between the two sides. There's a reason, the president's party usually does badly in the midterms. And it usually is the president and his party go too far in that 2-year span. And I just don't think this is the way we should be doing this, to have like these 2 really productive years followed by a stalemate, followed by a presidential race that settles something. Then, some other party takes over, 2 more productive years, ideally, you'd have roughly the same amount of productivity, cycle by cycle, depending on what the country's problems and needs are. So anyway, it sounds like a better idea to me, Greg. We'll see if we can get how many liberals we can get to sign on to this idea.
Yeah, they're going to love it, at least for now. And then when they get a president, I don't even know what you're talking about. When did we ever say that? All right, on to our bad martini now, Jim. And last week, Dan Foster and I talked about this, and we suspected that the news that we're about to discuss would be happening this week, since there was a meeting between the publisher for the Weekly Standard and the Weekly Standard editor, Steve Hayes, and now we know it's official. CNN, the Weekly Standard, the magazine that espouses traditional conservatism and which has remained deeply critical of President Donald Trump, will shutter after 23 years. Clarity Media Group, the owner of its publisher, announced Friday morning Weekly Standard will publish its final issue on December 17th. The announcement came after the magazine's editor-in-chief, Stephen Hayes, met privately with Ryan McKibben, the chairman of the Weekly Standard's publisher, Media DC. In a press release, McKibben says, for more than 20 years, the Weekly Standard has provided a valued and important perspective on political, literary, and cultural issues of the day. The magazine has been home to some of the industry's most dedicated and talented staff, and I thank them for their hard work and contributions, not just to the publication, but to the field of journalism. Employees were told they would be paid through the end of the year, and that afterward they would receive severance, which would range in scale depending on factors like seniority. There are tweets out there, though, saying everybody had to have their desk cleaned out by 5 o'clock. Ugly to deal with any time of the year, right before Christmas, especially difficult. Jim, obviously, they're a competitor, have been for over 2 decades now, but the quality of most of the folks over there at the Weekly Standard is not even really debatable. You think of not only Steve Hayes, but Fred Barnes, Mark Hemingway, Andy Ferguson, Matt Labash, just to name a few. And there's so many others that have gone through there over the past 23 years. It's a sad day. Dan and I talked last week about whether it was a factor. It's pretty clear at this point it's not the factor, that the Weekly Standard had staked out a position amongst conservatives as essentially an anti-Trump outlet. The more we're hearing, this seems to be a purely business decision here, Jim, but what's your reaction? Clearly a very dark day for the Weekly Standard.
This stinks on ice. This is a really dark day in, I'd say, American journalism, not just conservative journalism or Washington journalism. For those wondering, the Weekly Standard was our rival, but it was a friendly rivalry. I believe it was one of the few places when I started working at National Review. We thank God my employer has a really easygoing attitude towards freelancing. If you have the time and energy to write something else for some other publication, by and large, they're okay with it. They said there's one you can't, and that's the Weekly Standard. They did not want to see our writers appearing somewhere else, but it's worth noting there's been quite a bit of cross-pollinization. You mentioned Mark Hemingway. Used to do videos and work with him here at National Review. Jay Nordlinger, one of our contributors, was managing editor over there for a while. You saw a lot of cross-pollinization between the two magazines. And I suppose you could say there's a little bit of an ideological difference, but not a huge one. They were always perceived as being neoconservative, thanks to William Crystal and, I guess to a lesser extent, Barnes. John Podhoretz was doing a film review and various other essays for them every now and then. Were they less conservative? Just a different kind of philosophy and which issues were most preeminent and highest focus among them. It started in 94. I believe the first one was about Newt Gingrich and this philosophy of permanent offense and how House Republicans are always going to be on offense and never go back on their heels. Didn't quite turn out that way, but it was dynamic. It was exciting. It was funny. It was often very smart and very well informed. Charles Krauthammer wrote a lot of his longer pieces for them. Just a great bunch, and kind of fascinating, but you look back and you realize that, Fred Barnes had used to be with the New Republic. There were a bunch of, kind of not quite liberal voices in the ranks of there. They were some of the folks who ended up, getting over and starting the Weekly Standard. It was a really great, enjoyable magazine, and I'm really heartbroken to see it go. And from the hub, they were anti-Trump, so that's why. Well, hold on a second. It's worth noting. My understanding is that the web traffic was actually up, which is not something you usually see happen right before a magazine goes under. And the second thing I'm hearing is that, look, they're owned by Phil Unchlitz, who owns the Washington Examiner as well. Washington Examiner wants to create a magazine. Well, I'm hearing through the grapevine, and it's worth noting that apparently people at the Weekly Standard had the choice of, we'll give you severance through the end of the year if you sign this non-disclosure agreement. So, Greg, I don't know about you. It's good to see they're cheering for the First Amendment goes all the way to the end. Huh? Oh, no, wait, it's not that. Basically, the word is, that from those who have chosen not to sign the non-disclosure agreements, is that, the added folks at the Washington, the Phil Unschlitz's, higher powers that be decided that the Weekly Standard, they did not want to continue, and they were not interested in selling it, which almost never happens. So I suspect there's a lot more to be told to this story. It is just repulsive that it ended with a lot of good people losing their jobs and a lot of murmurs about some new magazine getting started with the same staff. It'd be interesting to see if that occurs, but just a dark, frustrating day. I think the world of journalism will be worse off without the Weekly Standard, and I hope everybody over there ends up in some good perch in some other publication.
All right, Jim, let's move over to our crazy martini now. And speaking of a guy who's had a pretty rough week, Michael Cohen, President Trump's former attorney, although his rough week is almost entirely self-inflicted. He pled
Actually, it's a long run of rough weeks that are just getting started.
That's very, very true. Starting in March,
he's looking for about 3 rough years, probably. Yeah. So
yeah, I don't think he's going to do too well there. But anyway, President Trump's been tweeting about him a lot. So just a couple days after his sentencing, and he doesn't go to prison until March 6th, he did an interview with George Stephanopoulos of ABC News, going over a lot of things. Says he's actually a free man now, even though he's headed to prison, because he's no longer just blindly doing the bidding of Donald Trump. And he says there's more to come with Trump and Russia, and Trump absolutely knew about how they were going to do the hush money payments for the 2 women that he allegedly had the affairs with. And so then he was asked about the Donald Trump he knew at Trump Tower and the Donald Trump in the White House. And he says the one in the White House is completely different because it's not what he expected it to be. The job's a lot harder, et cetera, et cetera. And then Cohen says this is how he wants to be remembered.
The country has never been more divisive, and one of the hopes that I have out of the punishment that I've received, as well as the cooperation that I have given, I will be remembered in history as helping to bring this country back together.
Jim, Michael Cohen's still, I think, a fairly young guy. 3 years in prison, he'll still be a fairly young guy. And if he truly is a changed person, maybe we'll see him contribute to society in ways that he clearly didn't have much interest in doing before. So to say that he's can't be a positive force in society is going too far. But to suggest that he thinks his legacy is going to be to bring this country back together after the attitude he's had very publicly for a number of years now is a pretty tall order.
Greg, wouldn't you say, though, that he already has united America in the sense that just about everybody hates him now? I mean, look, if you're, this is one of the things I think was fascinating, because I was, watching the great American baking show last night, and they were promoting, the first interview with Michael Cohen, a notorious liar, a guy who constantly couldn't tell the truth if his life depended on it. Watch the first breaking interview with him tomorrow on Good Morning America. And I'm sitting there thinking, well, wait a second. If the guy's a notorious liar, why do we care what he says? It may be true. It may not be true. And I also don't know if I like this idea that Michael Cohen was the worst of the worst and absolutely the worst person possible. But now he's flipped, and now he's testifying against Trump, so he's a good guy. So hey, everybody, it's time to embrace Michael Cohen again. No, you don't get to do that. So it's going to be really fascinating. I don't think unless he goes the full Chuck Colson and genuinely turns around his life and turns around his values, I don't know if there's this grand redemptive arc for Michael Cohen. I think it just kind of demonstrates that there are a whole bunch of people who so loathe President Trump that they will embrace anyone, even his recently flipped lieutenants, if they feel like it helps push Trump out of office at some future date.
Yeah, absolutely right. And, Trump's right that, Cohen was absolutely in no way cooperating with the feds until he had his office raided, and then trouble started to pile up really, real quickly. And so he did cooperate to try and get a better deal, and it helped him a little bit probably. And now it's in his best interest to do what he's doing. So while he may have a genuine change of heart, he's also following his incentives. Let's not pretend that he's doing otherwise. Jim, on that odd note, we'll close for the day. Have a great weekend, and we'll convene again on Monday. Talk to you then.
See you Monday, Greg.
Jim Geraghty of National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks for being with us today. Have a wonderful weekend, everyone, and then join us again on Monday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.